Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
I'm driving home from work today, and I'm thinking about the podcast. Knowing that I'm going to be talking extensively about Violator, and specifically this week being the 35th anniversary of the album. So I decide to listen to it on the drive home. I can about get the entire album in on my commute. The iPod that's in my car, I put this in when I got the car about 10 years ago. And it's an old school iPod, but I have it attached to the stereo system. I pulled the music on that iPod. I haven't updated it in years because I have a lot of music on my own iPhone, which I also connect via Bluetooth, and then CDs that I still listen to as well. So that iPod I had originally pulled from iTunes a couple of computers ago, right? So, every time you go and update, if you're a Mac person like me, you end up, transferring everything from one computer to another and things change. And so packed on this iPod is just a lot of music going back, especially to the 90s and early 2000s. And so I put Violator on from the iPod. I never thought that I would get nostalgic for something other than the actual music I'm listening to. And what I mean by that is I get to Sweetest Perfection. I had ripped the music off of a disc when I had loaded the Depeche Mode albums onto my iTunes years ago and subsequently on the iPod. And because I ripped it from a disc, the audio started skipping from the rub marks on the disc. And as a matter of fact, I actually went and grabbed the disc itself. I have it right here in front of me, and it has the marks on the back of the disc from where I had loaded it, or I had kept it in a CD holder. And if you had a low quality CD holder, you got the rub marks on there, and you would get those skips and scratches. And it just cracked me up because I'm listening to the album and I'm just letting the music wash over me. And suddenly now Sweetest Perfection starts to skip. And I actually had feelings of nostalgia back from the 90s. I never, ever could have imagined that would have happened. I subsequently switched over to iTunes because I didn't have the disc in the car and listened to the deluxe version from there on the rest of my drive home. Welcome to the podcast. It is Depeche Mode, the podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode where we're going to talk about Violator this week. You can email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. As always, if you're enjoying this up on YouTube, be sure to not only like and subscribe to whatever podcast platform you're listening to, but also subscribe to my YouTube channel as well. This is as I mentioned, 35th anniversary of Violator. And I typically kind of avoid the anniversaries to a certain extent because they happen so frequently just because of how large Depeche Mode's discography is. And especially because a lot of albums and singles are released around this time frame for the band, there could be any number of albums that end up having an anniversary. I know we just had an anniversary for Black Celebration. As a matter of fact, I think there was one for Delta Machine as well. Obviously, Violator holds a very special place within the band's history and also the fandom. I've grabbed an article that I want to share with you. It comes from Distorted Sound magazine, and it gets into a bit of the history of the album, a few things that I wasn't aware of that hadn't been divulged in previous documentaries, one of which I've watched just over the course of the past week, and that would be from the remastered editions of the album. But I want to talk a little bit about when the album came out. And a lot of this is age-specific, right? I'm still in my teens, my early teens at this point in time, going back to 1989 and 1990. The only way that I can personally describe the release and the time around the era of Violator was just magical. It was absolutely magical. You know, we're coming off of the ride of the Music for the Masses era, We're coming off the release of that album a few years prior, the tour that followed, the Rose Bowl show that I was blessed to be able to attend at a young age of 15 years old, the subsequent release of 101, everything that entailed. We had CDs coming into prominence during that period of time. I remember purchasing 101. Specifically, I still remember I'm 99% sure it was Tower Records. I know it was in Newport Beach, where I went to go get the album 101, and I ended up getting it on a double cassette at the time, and was just now in that time period transitioning over to CDs as they were released. And back then, as I've made mention so many times on the show, we have to wait now 4, if not more years, if there's a pandemic, for Depeche Mode to release an album, as their schedule will certainly get longer and longer between releases as the years and decades went on. But back then, a year at that age, being 16, 17, 18 years old, felt like just an absolute eternity. But it really hadn't been on that all that long, and therefore that high that we're riding from the band is still lingering there as we breathlessly anticipate new music from this band that has become the soundtrack, right, to my life and to your life as well. We're introduced to the next era of Depeche Mode through Personal Jesus. I've told this story many times before on the podcast. I'll do a condensed version again, but I recall hearing the acoustic version of Personal Jesus first. I'm pretty sure they had played it on K-Rock before I'd heard the fully produced version. Living in Santa Ana, California at the time, I remember finally getting my hands on the cassette single for Personal Jesus, putting my headphones on, and hearing the fully produced Personal Jesus. The sound bouncing from ear to ear in stereo, right? And just, I can still picture myself and put myself in my bed, in my bedroom, second floor of the home that I lived in Santa Ana, listening to Personal Jesus, just dumbfounded at the production, the lyrics, the driving beat, just all of it. Of course, the packaging that comes around any Depeche Mode release is always crucial and important. We have Anton Corbijn now, the guiding visual director for the band, introducing us to kind of what we would see later on relating to the artwork that he would do for music for for Songs of Faith and Devotion in the artwork initially for the cover of Personal Jesus. What we end up getting with the album is something cleaner, simplified, with an ominous title of Violator, and of course the photographs and the imagery, a bit naughty at the time, from Anton Corbijn, and a preview of what would come later as we get closer and closer to the release of Violator and the anticipation. Now, Personal Jesus is a song that I love, sometimes more than others. The experience that I had driving home today listening to the album was very unique, because often I find myself listening to tracks differently, even though I've heard them thousands upon thousands of times over in the context of my reasoning for listening to the album, or just in the context of the other songs around it. They take on a different vibe, takes on a different emotion. I really loved Personal Jesus when it came out, but at that age and at that time, I'm a bit of a Depeche Mode apologist. This would come to serve me well when Songs of Faith and Devotion came out, because that was an album that was much less accessible and pedestrian based off of what came before it with Violator. That's not to downplay Violator at all, but just by comparison, it was a tougher album to sort of accept, even though I've grown to absolutely adore and love that album. We get Enjoy the Silence. We know what an absolute gem of a track that is, a song that I listen to on an almost daily basis. But when it comes time for the release of Violator and we begin to see the artwork as it's presented, and here you have just this black canvas of a cover with this prominent red rose Anton Corbijn and his simplified version of the Depeche Mode logo with the cursive written Violator. So simple, yet so profound and impactful. The magic continues with looking at the album. Such a difference from what we saw from Music for the Masses and the art direction from Music for the Masses. Not to mention just the difference in terms of the songs in and of themselves. While absolutely and wholly Depeche Mode, we are suddenly faced with something much different. This is a band that's growing up even further, just as we are now growing up. As we're now fully into and embracing the era of Violator upon its release. I still remember the long boxes, and I remember collecting those long boxes in the way that they used to go and sell the CDs, and you'd get the fuller version of the artwork. And it was always amazing when it came to Depeche Mode and those long boxes, especially when it comes to Violator, where you get the full rows as opposed to the shortened one on the CD cover. Same thing rings true when it comes to the album cover for Black Celebration and the long box. I remember just seeing the entirety of the artwork on the long box. I was working for a Music Plus at the time in I guess it was Tustin. Yeah, it was Tustin in Southern California. So when I've talked about my time selling the tickets for the World Violation tour, but receiving the album, waiting and anticipating for it to come out, seeing the artwork, not knowing what's around the corner, not knowing what is going to be revealed when we play the tracks for the very, very first time. I don't recall, apart from hearing, again, the lead singles off the album of Personal Jesus and Enjoy the Silence, and then the acoustic version of Enjoy the Silence, and subsequently the harmonium version, the stripped-down original demo-esque version of Martin Gore and what his original iteration was for Enjoy the Silence. So I don't recall hearing other tracks from the album. But from the get-go, you knew you were in for something special. When you begin to play Violator and the opening keyboard for World in My Eyes kicks in, and the song just slowly but surely begins to kick into overdrive, a consistent theme among Depeche Mode's classic tracks, so many of their songs. I'm going to use this word relentless quite a bit because this is what I was feeling today, especially with the track like World in My Eyes. May he rest in peace, Andy Fletcher, his favorite song, a song that I put up there with Never Let Me Down Again in terms of its anthemic qualities. Probably would choose World in My Eyes over Never Let Me Down Again, but it is an absolutely amazing track, and I was struck today driving home listening to it of the driving keyboard riff in the background and how it's almost like that keyboard riff just wants to escape the track itself, as it just keeps going. I mean, Alan Wilder's footprint and stamp is all over all of these songs. The songs just build and build and build, and almost as if you're waiting for them to just break open and unleash beyond the constraints of what they've been confined to in keeping time and rhythm, ending at the perfect moment when you've almost had enough, not in a bad way, but almost like I can't take any more of the joy that I'm receiving from this particular track. The album opens with this banger of a track of World in My Eyes, and then it subtly seduces you into thinking that you're now in safer territory. There's this sense of danger lurking behind it as Sweetest Perfection kicks in, and Martin Gore begins to sing, accented and driven by the lyrical content of the song in and of itself, and I'll talk more about the lyrics of the album, because I feel like Violator is the one album that really does sort of encapsulate so many different, if not all of the wide range of emotions and situations that one would deal with in being in love. The title Violator in and of itself I find really funny because the band thought of it as a joke. They wanted something that was harder edged, sort of as a mockery to the heavy metal of the day, and yet the song, the album title in and of itself, in my opinion, really does fit the thematic quality of the album, where it's almost, the album is almost a violation in and of itself, in that one could extrapolate that the lyrical content embedded in these amazing tracks, as if somebody were spying on your own life and were writing songs about what they had witnessed by being a fly on the wall, invading and violating your privacy. And how relatable, while also being ambiguous, Martin's lyrics were. And of course, with Sweetest Perfection, a song that just has this dangerous undertone, inclusion of dangerous as a B-side intended here. But you get about midway through the song and suddenly you realize that you thought maybe you were in friendly territory, but now this song builds up and kicks in with this massive drum beat, almost pulling you along for this ride, dealing with these lyrics that you're not quite sure of. What is being sung to me in this moment of sweetest perfection? Why am I calling this my own? And the song just builds and builds and builds, and suddenly what you initially think is a rather simple track turns into this thunderous, again, sort of anthem, almost as an antithesis to what came before it with World in My Eyes. Now, this of course continues in a weird way, because suddenly now you're faced back in familiar territory. In the context of hearing the album for the first time, beginning to end, without ever hearing, say, Enjoy the Silence or Personal Jesus, it might have been a different experience. But for me, it's almost like you get a relief. It's like, okay, here's Personal Jesus. I know this song. I'm aware of what I'm getting into with this track. I'm reminded, though, of Personal Jesus. And again, things you think about, even after thousands of listens and decades apart, 35 years. And I'm reminded, while I know this song backwards and forwards, and if you were to take any single element out of a remix or the album version, I could tell you somebody messed with that track. I'm suddenly struck and surprised again at how the end of the song has almost this remix vibe to it. Something that Depeche Mode would continue to do later on, right? I was reminded of Cover Me all of the sudden. I'm reminded of Speak to Me and how the band likes to go, and we're sort of to the end of the story in terms of the lyrics and what they're saying, and yet the song's not over. We're going to riff and we're going to twist and we're going to bend, and we're going to give you an album track that in and of itself has a bit of a remix embedded in it. Of course, the band would go and replicate this on every single tour, changing up that aspect of the original track and making it unique from tour to tour. But I was reminded that they did that initially with the album version of Personal Jesus, and the way that the song sort of deconstructs at the end of it. So as you're given this bit of respite because of the familiarity around Personal Jesus, suddenly now you're faced with this track called Halo. Ominous, foreboding, yet comforting at the same time. A song that probably should have been a single, so much so that they went and made a video for the track. One of my favorite songs on the album. Always a joy when it makes an appearance. Love the version on the Exciter tour. But Halo is just another thunderous, heartbreaking song. And so tapped into my own psyche as a young teenager who, despite my devotion to Depeche Mode and my love of this band at the time, in a world without the internet, in a world without smartphones, where the focus was either the music in my life, church to a lesser extent back then, but mostly finding female companionship, having gone through already a series of relationships and ultimately breakups that would occur up until meeting my wife and marrying her for the past 25 years. This song in and of itself, when our worlds they fall apart, though we may deserve it, it will be worth it. I mean, just an absolute knife to the heart, and one that you are more than happy to have shoved into you over and over and over again. Give me my punishment. Keep me chained here to endure this over and over again, because the pain feels good. We're given a break with Waiting for the Night to Fall. But even then, there's this undertone where you're just not quite sure. It's beautiful. It's cinematic. You get both Dave and Martin going back and forth and singing these songs. The song itself it feels confident, and yet it still is unnerving in its beauty. Now I can't help but hear that song and be immediately brought back to the World Violation Tour. The images of Anton Corbijn up on stage. It is a tragedy that we never got a proper physical release of that tour. Pray that doesn't happen when it comes to Memento Mori. And it's interesting because Flood, who of course produced both Violator and Songs of Faith and Devotion, in the documentaries relating to Songs of Faith and Devotion, he characterized Violator as being, approachable and acceptable, while Songs of Faith and Devotion was this thing in the corner that you had to approach cautiously. And I would almost go and argue that there's something very much in line with that and Violator as well. I see more of what would come in Songs of Faith and Devotion with Violator. Because Violator is not necessarily an album. While I think at the time it was easily approachable and listenable, and it didn't take a few listens to kind of figure out what you were getting, there was still this ominous nature behind it. People look to Black Celebration, appropriately so, in terms of sort of being the dark side of Depeche Mode. And while so many of these tracks carry that pop sensibility about it, I know Flood had, alluded to several comments about, Nine Inch Nails and his working on Pretty Hate Machine, and then wanting to take sort of a pop sensibility to the darkness of what Depeche Mode was doing. And he really did accomplish that with this album, because it is ominous in so many ways. You get into Enjoy the Silence, though, coming out of Waiting for the Night, and we begin back on that upswing as we look at the home stretch of this album that only stretches 9 tracks long, but that makes it almost perfect, relating to the album's sequencing and brevity. I understand, I love the B-sides off of it. I think the B-sides of Dangerous, Happiest Girl, and Sea of Sin, I think it speaks to just the quality of music that they were producing at the time. And while I may have made arguments in the past that they should have been included on the album, at the end of the day, no, leave them as B-sides. I think there are other albums you could look at where the band would have done well to go and strip out some of the tracks to create a tighter record full of solid gold, as opposed to some tracks that just didn't quite make it. And I'm thinking specifically about Sounds of the Universe and Delta Machine. And I know those tracks that people would remove is going to vary from person to person, and we'll get into this when we get into listener feedback this week. But Enjoy the Silence, one of their best tracks ever. And so we come out of Waiting for the Night. We're now into Enjoy the Silence. Again, a song that we're already somewhat comfortable and familiar with by the time of the release of the album. And then you get into Policy of Truth. And just again, another epic anthem of a Depeche Mode track. Its driving beats, the keyboard work on the album, But once again, the lyrical content. Every single song on this album, I could go and point to relating to a relationship that I went through at some point in time. And this would continue, throughout my teens and into my adult life. But Policy of Truth was just something, yeah, man, we've all been there. Never again is what you swore the time before. Those times when you wish you hadn't gone and told the truth, or you had kept these things to yourself. Again, it was a heartbreak that you're willing to go through again and again and again, just because the heartbreak feels so good, because that is what Depeche Mode does in such a masterful way. And then comes in a track like Blue Dress, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Rob Rom of the Global Depeche fan group has his own thoughts on this. But I love Blue Dress. There's a specificity about it that makes it a little bit more ambiguous, a little less ambiguous in terms of the lyrical content of Blue Dress and the individual of Martin's eye wearing the blue dress. But again, the lyrics in and of themselves are something that are, for me personally, always absolutely relatable. I'm actually going to the liner notes. I could have done it off the top of my head, but I feel like reading them. Put it on and don't say a word. Put it on, the one that I prefer. Put it on and stand before my eyes. Put it on and don't question why. This desire to, and while he's maybe talking about a dress here, it could be anything. Come to me and don't question why. Right? But this call to the object of affection, can you believe something so simple, something so trivial makes me a happy man? Say you believe just how easy it is to please me, because when you learn, you'll know what makes the world turn. And again, at that age, always being somewhat of a hopeless romantic, I mean, this song was just the love song of all love songs for me. I'll be here for you, I'll protect you, but just you don't know how easy it is for you to make me happy. Selfish. No doubt. But when you consider, again, the age of so many of us, and me in particular, you're not really thinking about it in terms of that. You're just thinking about it in terms of wanting to be loved. Having my parents gone through a divorce, constantly seeking that, what's the word I'm looking for? Confirmation, affirmation, that love in somebody else. I knew my parents loved me, but they had split up. I was a divided family right now, and I needed something to go and fill this void that was no longer there, and looking for female companionship. And then you get to the end of the album, and you've gone on this journey, and the album in and of itself wrapping up on Clean, almost as if to say, if you're unsure of what you've just been through and what you've experienced, here we are to let you know that there's an out. We've gone through this emotional roller coaster of all of these tracks, reminded of all these relationships that we've been through, relationships that we will go through. And then you get to Clean, this driving, again, ominous song. Instead of ending up on this high note, you're going through the last paces of everything that you've just endured. Clean, the cleanest I've been, or as they sing it, been. And then to the tears, the in-between years, and the troubles that I've seen, now that I'm clean, almost as if the album in and of itself, and no intent here to be sacrilegious, but almost as if you've gone through some sort of religious ceremony and you've come back out on the other side. You've been baptized in the 8 songs that came before it, and now we're going to cleanse you of whatever sins you may have endured in your journey that started with World in My Eyes and ended up with this clarion call to the one that you love. Just understand how to make me happy. If you've made any mistakes along the way, don't worry, this is the cleanest that you'll ever be. Listen, it's the album that sustained the band and the reason why we still get music from them until this day. You can't convince me otherwise. This was their apex mountain, the height of their popularity, and the genius, the strength, and the masterpiece that is Violator has sustained Depeche Mode until this day. If it hadn't been for Violator, we wouldn't have had Memento Mori or anything that came before it. Sure, there are masterpieces that came prior, Black Celebration being one of them, and one that followed afterwards with Songs of Faith and Devotion. But we never would have gotten Songs of Faith and Devotion without the strength and the confidence that it gave the band and what they were able to accomplish with Violator. And they may lean back into that on occasion, but they never went back to this, and they never need to go back to Violator. I'm glad they didn't do Violator 2.0. Because it stands alone as a testament to the greatness of this band and allowed them the opportunity to endure and continue. How many songs do we consistently get off of Violator on every single tour? It was such a magical time. Everything attached to this album, the artwork, the t-shirts, the singles, top to bottom, back and forth, up and down, it doesn't matter. It's all fantastic. Remixes, the tour, it was incredible. Absolutely incredible. I feel so blessed to have been able to have gone through that time period. I'm jealous of those who were able to experience the era of Black Celebration, as I came in right on the backside of that in my fandom. But when you consider how great Black Celebration was, and music for the masses as well, they achieved greatness. That tour was amazing. They were breaking in the United States, but it was Violator that put them on the map. Just an absolutely incredible album. And I still get the same vibes, just holding it in my hand and looking at the cover. There is something fresh about it. It never stales. It never gets old. The songs are absolutely timeless. And I'm just glad that I have the opportunity, again, just to be able to take 30 minutes and just speak from the heart about this album that has meant so much to me and really did become the absolute soundtrack of my life at a time when I was finding out who I was going to be as a person. And Violator helped me figure that out. Tom Fordham in Distorted Sound magazine writes, recorded in various studios in Milan, Italy, and Denmark in mid-1989, Depeche Mode worked with British rock and synth-pop record producer and audio engineer Mark Ellis, also known as Flood. This was the first time they would work with Flood. The album would be mixed by French DJ Francois Kevorkian, and unlike their previous albums, the band would try a new approach, with Wilder stating in a 1990 NME interview with Stuart Macione, usually we begin making a new record by having extensive pre-production meetings where we decide what the record will actually sound like. Then we go into the programming in the studio. This time around, we kept all the pre-production work to a minimum. We were beginning to have a problem with boredom in what we felt we'd reached a certain level of achievement in doing things a certain way. With Gore adding in the same interview, over the last 5 years, I think we'd perfected a formula, my demos, a month programming in the studio, etc., etc. We decided that our first record of the 1990s ought to be different. Now, the demos would be less complete than Gore's previous efforts. This came as a request from Wilder, as the rigid, almost finished demos for Music for the Masses had a limiting effect on Depeche Mode's creativity as a band. Gore agreeing to this request provided sparser demos with basic recordings that consisted of vocals over a simple guitar or organ parts, occasionally with a percussion loop. But overall, it was less sequential, and this allowed the band to have more creative liberties, which led to songs like Enjoy the Silence being transformed from a slow ballad to an up-tempo anthem. Throughout the recording process, Wilder and Flood would strike up a complementary working relationship. Flood would give Wilder the technical support while he was working on arrangements and song textures. In Steve Mullen's biography of the band, Wilder would state, "That's how we made the group work at the time," clarified Wilder. By accepting that we all had different roles and not actually all trying to do the same thing. So we ended up with this unwritten agreement with the band where we'd all throw together a few ideas at the beginning of a track. Then Fletch and Mart would go away, and they'd come back after we'd worked on it for a while to give an opinion. The critical reception was mostly positive. Melody maker, music critic Paul Lester called Violator Depeche Mode's most arresting work to date. Tim Nicholson of Record Mirror was enthused by the stripped-down quality of the songs and called the album a compromise between pop music and something a little more sinister. In a less favorable review, Rolling Stone magazine's Chuck Eddy stated that Gone sounds slimy and self-involved, and in their attempt to make the album's listeners dance, they revert to morose pop psychology and never tell you how come they're so sad. By the way, this idea, and this is the subtlety and seductiveness of Violator. Because as Tim Nicholson writes here, the stripped-down quality of the songs, they're not. There's a lot going on in the background of those tracks. And there's a lot, as I mentioned, that just wants to burst out at any moment. World in My Eyes is the one that sticks out to me the most. There was something that they did with the Route 66 Behind the Wheel remix and what they did on tour for World Violation with the relenting keyboard that is rocking out for as much as the keyboard can rock out. Something very similar happens in World in My Eyes. And it is dopamine just right through my veins every single time I hear it. You think it's stripped down, but it's not. And that's the genius behind the album. Now, it says here, despite the last remark, right, making the album's listeners dance, right, reverts to morose pop psychology, and they never tell you why you've become so sad. The album would release to exceptional commercial success, reaching number 1 in the album charts of Belgium, France, Greece, and Spain, coming in at number 2 in the UK and Germany, and number 7 in the US. A sign of Depeche Mode's rising popularity came at the event in Los Angeles. Was expected to draw only a few thousand fans, ended up drawing a crowd of 17,000, with the band being forced to withdraw over security concerns. The tour to support the album, the World Violation Tour, saw the band play several stadium shows in the U.S. 42,000 tickets were sold in 4 hours for a show at Giant Stadium. 48,000 tickets sold in a half hour of going on sale for Dodger Stadium. I was there. 1.2 million fans seeing the tour internationally. The success of Violator introduced a new and wider audience to Depeche Mode, which saw them surge in popularity. Fletcher would later recall, before this, we'd been going along quite nicely. Then when it came to Violator, we inexplicably went huge. It was just incredible. And in many ways, we never really recovered from that. After that, we just felt like we wanted to muck it up a bit. The band was the epitome of cool at the time for all 4 of the band members. And just the absolute coolest was Dave. The unlikeliest of likely rock stars. His stage performance just hitting new heights every single time they did a show. And his vocal, and I don't know if I've ever gotten into it, but Dave's vocals on tour, still to this day, and while it's been shaky depending on the tour, Sounds of the Universe is the one that sticks out the most. I have mentioned this in the past where It's tough for me to watch the Live in Barcelona Blu-ray, even though it's a cool show. One, because as I've said, I think the visuals for Anton are really lacking on that tour. The musical arrangements are fine, but Dave's vocals are just so nasally on that tour. Less so Spirit, more so Memento Mori, but Dave's vocals, especially back during this time period, were just so good. Just on point every single time. It doesn't surprise me at all that Dave ended up getting addicted to drugs. How else do you continue that high? Not a justification for it by any stretch, and truly inspirational the way that Dave has been able to come out of that and just continue to work with Martin and prior to his passing Fletch and making just incredible music all these decades removed. But at the time, yeah, I can totally understand. You're coming off of a high of creating something like Violator, the tour to follow, the massive success. How do you maintain that in your life if you're not wholly prepared to deal with it at such a young age? I'll say this much too. In terms of eras, the Violator era and Songs of Faith and Devotion is a close second here, right? We're riding a wave after we finish up with the World Violation Tour, a few years, kind of in between as we wait for Songs of Faith and Devotion. That era was epic and awesome, just absolutely incredible in a wholly different fashion. Songs of Faith and Devotion had much more of this religious aspect of it for me personally. Again, no sacrilege intended whatsoever to my Lord God Almighty. That being said, while Violator, I'm still sort of coming into my own as an adult with this album, becoming an even bigger fan than I thought I could be of this band. By the time you get to Songs of Faith and Devotion, now we're going to church. Now I'm into adulthood. I've experienced some things, and this album is speaking to me with regard to all of that. All right, let's get to your listener feedback this week. As I mentioned, Rob Rom, Global Depeche fan group. Matt's challenge, my buddy Matt, the 3-song set, you can only pick one side of an album, is pretty interesting, writes Rob. I did get a laugh out of potentially another point for a future show. Your 3-song pick, that would be mine for Violator. And today, as he's writing this, being the anniversary of its release, has one of my skippers. In fact, the only song I skip on Violator, Blue Dress. Rob, how could you? My 3 from Violator would be Waiting for the Night, Enjoyed the Silence, and Policy of Truth. Notable. On the point of skippers, mine from other notable albums are Get Right With Me. Again, Rob, how could you? From Songs of Faith and Devotion, and New Dress from Black Celebration. I'm kind of with you on that one. Interesting track, but the politics in Depeche Mode has not been anything that I typically go and lean into, unless we're talking about Everything Counts. Interestingly enough, I don't have any skippers on Some Great Reward. Maybe a good future topic if you haven't covered it before. I haven't. I will. Well, I should, and I will. And thank you, Rob. Hope you're doing well. All right, let's go to Ali Joffrey, who writes this. Hello again from the island of Madeira. It's said like the wine. Unfortunately, I'm probably still saying it wrong because I'm not familiar with the wine either. Forgive me. But I think it's Madeira. As much as I love Depeche Mode and Memento Mori, there's something about the production on this album, especially the vocal treatment, that keeps bothering me. I've always admired how Dave's baritone voice seamlessly blends with the instrumentation on albums like Songs of Faith and Devotion, Ultra, and Violator. The lush, expansive reverbs on his vocals don't just add depth, they create a sense of grandeur, making everything feel larger than life and deeply immersive, almost like it's floating in outer space. Even from Exciter onwards, when the vocals became relatively drier, they still felt integrated, wrapped inside the mix in a way that retained warmth and cohesion. However, in Memento Mori, the choice of an ultra-soft tiled room delay effect and super loud vocal levels gives a confined, almost singing in the shower effect, rather than the floating in the vast soundscapes that DM is known for. Dave's voice now sits atop all of the instrumentation. And while I get that this creates a more intimate feel, to me it compromises some of that signature ethereal atmosphere and soundscape that makes their sound so captivating. An unpopular opinion, curious to hear what you think. Does this vocal treatment on Memento Mori work for you, or do you miss that expansive cinematic depth? So, for me personally, here's what I find interesting. And that is, I hadn't thought about that with Memento Mori. I'll give it another listen and see what my thoughts are upon reading your email. I did always notice the vocals on Spirit, however, which are different than what they sound on Memento Mori, which I also thought was odd since James Ford produced both. I think that Marta Solongni on Memento Mori, and I'd love to see that team again together. I mentioned this last week. I'd also love to see Flood return as well, but be that as it may, even though I know that he did do some work on Delta Machine. But I always noticed just how different the vocals were on Spirit as opposed to any other album. Now, I'm sure someone's going to correct me. I remember watching a video, and I think it was Vaughn on YouTube, where they were talking about the microphone that they used. It was the microphone they used for Violator. I wanted to say they brought that microphone back for another album, but I believe it was the microphone they used on Violator was actually a fairly inexpensive microphone. All that is to say that on the drive home today, listening to Violator, I hadn't even really thought much about it until this listen today, because I was really just intently listening to all the different angles and layers of the songs. But this was the first time that I really noticed the processing on Dave's voice on Violator, whereas I think on Black Celebration, I've noticed it more. Now, that's also influenced by the fact that I know that Gareth Jones on the documentary from the remastered was very open about how they kept throwing reverb on the tracks. I'm also remembering the sound check for Music for the Masses for the 101 tour for the Rose Bowl show, where the two sound guys, the mixers, are there at the console, and you know you can wet them and wet them and wet them, but they still sound clear. I remember watching that. I might have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds cool. So I'll give, I hadn't thought about that with Memento Mori. I genuinely love the production work on Memento Mori. I'm reminded of this constantly when I listen to the songs that I usually put together a couple songs. I've mentioned this before, but I usually put together a couple songs that I go to bed every night listening to, and typically it's Depeche. And lately I've been listening to the sort of combination of Last Dinner Party that I've talked about, songs off of Songs of Faith and Devotion, and Memento Mori. And it always sticks out because the production on Songs of Faith and Devotion is of such lesser a quality than Memento Mori, just even in the loudness of the tracks. But the production work on Songs of Faith and Devotion is my only complaint on that album. It's really hard to crank those tracks without the mix just getting lost and jumbled because of how dense the songs are. I don't know if it's a matter of my sound system and if I need to... Like, it'd be one of those things where if somebody had a solution on that and they said, yes, if you have a 15-bank equalizer, mixer, where you can go and individually adjust everything, these are the adjustments you need to make to hear a crisp and clean album. Now, I know the album wasn't designed that way, but certainly in terms of the way that Violator sounds versus Songs of Faith and Devotion, I just always felt that the production work on that album was a little bit muddled. Allie goes on to say, I've been thinking, anyone else notice the subtle symbolism and visual echo between Martin's trousers during Memento Mori tour and the lyrics of Halo? Is Martin wearing guilt like shackles on his feet like a halo in reverse? Sometimes, only sometimes, I question everything. Allie Joffrey. I haven't, but I am very much looking forward to picking up the new live Depeche Mode book from the people that did Monument. And I hope that there is some focus on Martin's stage attire. I mean, hey, you could do a whole book on Dave and Martin's stage attire in and of itself from all the various tours. So I thank you so much, Allie. And then let's see. Is this the last one? Yes, last one here this week. Quiet week this week, but that's okay. Peter Schwab out of Stockholm, Sweden writes this. Thanks for the nice podcast, John. I was thinking about Depeche Mode's first album, Speak and Spell, and found out recently that there are actually 3 versions of it. There's a UK version, the US version, and the European EU version. The EU version I grew up to in the 80s in Sweden is almost the same as the US version, with Dreaming of Me, the single, instead of I Sometimes Wish I Was Dead. But the EU version, there are no maxi singles of New Life or Just Can't Get Enough, just the single versions. So I thought I would go and make my own version. He sent me a link for Spotify. The album is still 11 songs and 40 minutes, but I removed No Disco and What's Your Name. See, I would have left No Disco in. I kind of dig that track. What's Your Name is an oddity. It's there, but it's an oddity. Because I think they are the weakest, although they have their charm. Exactly. They could be B-sides. Instead, I put in Ice Machine. Good call. And I Sometimes Wish I Was Dead. So this is my ultimate version of the album. So New Life, Puppets, Dreaming of Me, Boys Say Go, Ice Machine, side 1. Side 2, I Sometimes Wish I Was Dead, Photographic, Tora, 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 Big Muff, Any Second Now, and Just Can't Get Enough. Dreaming of Me should be the nice single version with the fade out and not the longer version with the strange ending. Ice Machine was good to have as at least one song, to have as the last song on side 1. Here, just 5 songs because of the slower and slower ending with that note in A minor. It feels like a proper ending on side A. And if I could use the 3-track order game here, Matt, your game lives on. It would be Dreaming of Me, Boys Say Go, and Ice Machine. I know, it's not allowed. I sometimes wish I was dead, but I didn't want to use it / waste it in 2 seconds at the beginning of the album like the UK version. I think it belongs better to save it and have it later as the start of side 2. Here, 6 songs, and the rest of the album is like it was before. The thing is, I think this track order works very well, so I can't really go back to any other versions of the album. All those songs came out in 1981, so theoretically, this could have been the album in my fantasy at least. Keep up the good work. Best regards, Peter from Sweden. Thank you very much, Peter. And listen, I think that, out of all the albums you can do that with, Speak and Spell is the one where you get a free pass. I've gone and made special versions of albums and mixes, especially since iPhones came around, right? But I always found myself kind of going, I'm not listening to the genuine article. This isn't what the band intended. I think it's part of the curse of being a Depeche Mode fan, depending on what kind of fan you are. I guess it's part of my curse of being a Depeche Mode fan. At the end of the day, I'm kind of a purist. I put together a sort of a Memento Mori 2.0 version where I took some of those mixes that I really, really enjoyed and I put them together in an album. And it's fun. But that's really all that it is fun. I like those tracks, and I'll listen to them separately like I would any tracks off of any Depeche Mode album. But if you're going to go and listen to the album and have the true experience, I always prefer the true experience of what the band had intended. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. I know I did. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. If it's your first time listening, thank you so much for checking it out. Again, subscribe to YouTube or whatever podcast platform you found it on. And since you love Depeche Mode, do you also read science fiction? If you do, I have a treat for you. Not only can you find yourself with a fun science fiction series to sink yourself into, you can also support Depeche Mode, the podcast. I've written a science fiction series, is what I'm trying to say. It's called EMBARK. There are 7 books in all in the series. I set this in the future, 2172, where air and spaceflight culture has replaced car culture. It is inspired in part by Depeche Mode, life in the so-called space age, the world we live in and life in general. Depeche Mode plays a large part in the underlying themes of the story, and the main character himself is a massive Depeche Mode fan at a time when the music of the 80s through the 2000s is nostalgic and popular among the characters of the story. Features references to Depeche Mode, both direct and indirect, while telling an exciting science fiction adventure space opera saga. After Earth faces its end, follow pilots Taft Catha and their ragtag crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. If you like your science fiction to be epic, filled with romance, cool technology, a lot of unique action sequences, EMBARK is perfect for you. I wrote the series for adults and my love of Star Wars, but it's great for ages 11 and older, completely age appropriate. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today to get started, but you can read any of the books in any order you like. While they tell a consistent saga, I wrote each story so it can be read on its own with plenty of prologue and backstory. They're available in ebook, Kindle Unlimited if you are a Kindle Unlimited user on Amazon, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook produced and narrated by me. Head on over to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK and Jon, Jon Justice. I'm back again next week, and I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you then. Have yourself a great week, devotees. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
Depeche Mode, the podcast.